shock at Bagshot Park. During a quiet family dinner in March 2025, Prince Edward broke decades of silence with an emotional confession about Princess Diana. His words were raw, unfiltered. "She was more royal than any of us." The remark shattered years of carefully protected palace narratives. When King Charles heard of it hours later, he locked himself in his study for nearly 2 hours, emerging in tears. A royal truth had been spoken, and nothing could undo it. The unexpected confession. On the evening of March 28, 2025, the royal family gathered quietly at Bagshot Park, the Surrey residence of Prince Edward and Sophie. The dinner was meant to be a private affair, limited to 12 guests, a mix of family and trusted friends. But as the night drew on, Edward, now 61 years old, stunned everyone at the table with words he had kept buried for nearly 3 decades. For the first time since August 1997, he spoke candidly about Princess Diana. Those present described his voice as steady but deeply emotional. "She was more royal than any of us," Edward said, his tone sharp with conviction. The phrase sent shock through the dining room. For decades, the monarchy had tried to control Diana's narrative, painting her as beloved by the people but difficult inside palace walls. Yet here was Elizabeth II's youngest son dismantling that carefully crafted image in one unfiltered sentence. Some guests were moved to tears. Others sat in stunned silence. One aide later whispered that Edward's choice of words was more than opinion. It was defiance. By equating Diana with royalty greater than the Windsors themselves, Edward had challenged the system from which he had quietly benefited for over 40 years. Even more striking was his decision to speak in front of confidants, ensuring that his words would not simply vanish into the night. The aftermath spread quickly. By dawn on March 29th, whispers of Edward's confession had reached Buckingham Palace. When King Charles heard, he reportedly locked himself in his study for nearly 2 hours. At 76 years old, Charles had weathered decades of criticism tied to Diana, yet the wound remained raw. To hear his younger brother describe Diana as the truest embodiment of the crown broke through his carefully maintained composure. Courtiers confirmed later, the king was reduced to tears. The confession rippled far beyond Bagshot Park. For the first time, the quietest Windsor had spoken openly about Diana, and his words landed like thunder. To understand the depth of Edward's outburst, one must look back at his subtle but profound bond with Diana. Their relationship was never splashed across tabloid covers, but behind the palace curtains, it was quietly transformative. One of the rare connections that offered Diana true solace amid suffocating royal silence. Edward and Diana's quiet bond. Unlike the grand staged photographs of the 1980s, Diana and Edward were rarely pictured together. Yet insiders recall a unique intimacy that grew quietly during the mid-1980s. Edward, then in his early 20s, often checked in on Diana during family gatherings. While others critiqued or lectured her, Edward reportedly leaned in with a single question: "Are you okay?" It was a phrase she rarely heard within the palace walls, and it struck her deeply. Staff who served during those years said Edward's approach was different from his siblings. He did not dismiss Diana's emotions, nor did he treat her vulnerabilities as threats. Instead, he listened. During the 1986 Balmoral Summer Retreat, Edward was noticed sitting with Diana for nearly 40 minutes on the castle lawn while others rode horses. They spoke quietly, faces serious, while Charles carried on elsewhere. It was clear Edward's role in her life was not loud, but it was steady. According to one aide, Diana once confided that Edward understood her better than Charles ever did. Coming from a woman whose marriage was collapsing by 1992, the statement carried weight. By 1991, when the Wales' separation became inevitable, Edward's quiet solidarity gave Diana a safe corner in a palace where she otherwise felt isolated. He never gossiped, never revealed her confessions, and never sought to control her emotions. For her, he was perhaps the only Windsor she trusted. Observers recall subtle but telling gestures. At public events between 1985 and 1995, Edward was often the one to walk toward Diana first, breaking the chilly distance other royals maintained. At one charity gala in 1993, he was seen pulling out her chair with care, a small act that palace staff whispered about for weeks. In a world where kindness was rare, Edward's gestures became her lifeline. That bond would later fuel speculation and suspicion within the family itself. But while Diana cherished Edward's empathy, others in the family viewed it as dangerous. Kindness toward Diana was seen as betrayal of the institution that often struggled to contain her. For Charles, already bitter from the breakdown of his marriage, Edward's visible loyalty felt like disobedience. And in one tense evening at Balmoral, that tension finally erupted into words. Words that would change the brothers' relationship forever. Charles grew suspicious of their closeness. It was during the summer of 1991 at Balmoral that the unease came to a head. Charles, then 42 years old, had grown increasingly suspicious of Edward's soft spot for Diana. Tensions inside the royal household were already high, with Diana openly resisting the traditional restrictions of royal life. Late one evening, after dinner, Charles allegedly confronted Edward directly in the library. "Why do you defend her so much?" he demanded. Witnesses recall Edward's reaction vividly. Instead of responding with anger, he chose silence. He set down his glass, stood up, and walked out of the room. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left a scar. For Charles, Edward's refusal to side with him was confirmation that his younger brother sympathized with Diana. For Edward, walking out was the only way to avoid fueling a fight that would split them further apart. From that night onward, the distance between the brothers grew. Charles viewed Diana's openness, her willingness to cry in public, to share her struggles in interviews such as Panorama 1995, as dangerous to the monarchy. Edward, however, saw her humanity as refreshing and necessary. Their opposing views were more than differences of personality. They represented two competing visions of what royalty should be in the late 20th century. Looking back, insiders now see that Balmoral moment as a turning point. It was the first visible fracture in sibling trust. Charles, always protective of royal tradition, never forgave Edward's quiet defense of Diana. Edward, in turn, carried the memory silently, choosing never to provoke further conflict. But the silence only deepened the rift, and decades later, in 2025, his unexpected confession about Diana would reopen wounds that had never truly healed. As whispers of Edward's loyalty resurfaced, attention shifted to the countless small gestures he had shown Diana. Gestures unnoticed by most, but unforgettable to her. While others looked away, Edward watched. While others dismissed, Edward cared. The unspoken moments between them now paint a picture of solidarity that history had long overlooked. And those quiet acts of compassion would prove just as powerful as his public confession decades later. The unspoken moments that said everything. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Edward quietly noticed what others ignored. Diana's radiant smile, often splashed across newspapers, was fading by 1991. Her eyes carried exhaustion during tours that lasted 12 hours a day. Her posture more fragile at charity events where she once glowed. Staff recalled how Edward would pause in corridors, watching her leave a room, sensing something was wrong long before others admitted it. His awareness was subtle, but it spoke volumes. Insiders revealed that in autumn 1992, during one of Diana's most difficult seasons, Edward wrote her a handwritten note. The paper bore his personal crest and carried just one line: "You matter." It was not advice, not correction, just reassurance. For Diana, who often felt belittled by the cold machinery of the crown, such words were life-giving. Friends said she kept the note folded inside her handbag for months afterward, rereading it during moments of despair. At public events, Edward's concern often showed in small, deliberate gestures. During a hospital opening in March 1994, Diana arrived visibly upset after relentless press coverage of her separation. Photographers captured Edward walking toward her first, pulling her aside briefly, whispering something that made her nod. Witnesses said she looked calmer afterward. It was Edward's pattern: quiet interventions, almost invisible to cameras, but deeply noticed by Diana herself. By 1995, as Diana's world became increasingly isolated, Edward's presence stood out even more. Rumors swirled among palace aides that Diana confided she felt safest around Edward compared to any other Windsor. Unlike Andrew, whose scandals often distracted, or Charles, whose distance hurt her, Edward's role was understated, yet consistent. He didn't shield her from the press or change the narrative, but he gave her what she lacked most: dignity. Those unspoken moments now stand as testament to their unusual bond. But the bond that had been forged quietly in gestures and words faced its ultimate test on the night of August 31st, 1997. When tragedy struck Paris, the world mourned loudly. Yet Edward's grief was unlike the others. It was private, silent, and unseen. And for the first time in his life, the youngest Windsor broke his usual composure to act in ways few have ever known. Gestures still whispered about nearly 3 decades later. Edward's reaction to Diana's death. When news of Diana's fatal crash broke at 4 a.m. on August 31st, 1997, the royal household was shaken. Edward, then 33 years old, was among the first to be woken. According to unconfirmed accounts from Paris staff, Edward quietly arranged a flight to the French capital later that morning, separate from the official delegation. Unlike Charles, who traveled for formal duties, Edward's purpose was personal. He wanted to see Diana before she was returned to Britain. Though never publicly acknowledged, several French hospital workers claimed Edward was present at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris that day. They described a tall, quiet man escorted discreetly by security around 11 a.m. Records remain sealed, but insiders insist Edward requested a private moment before Diana's body was prepared for transport. If true, it would explain his silence afterward, his grief expressed not in words, but in one last farewell, unseen by the cameras that swarmed the city. Back in Britain, Edward withdrew. In September, as Charles walked behind Diana's coffin with William, Harry, and Philip, Edward's role was more subdued. Yet aides said his absence from certain public appearances in late 1997 was not indifference, but grief. He reportedly avoided 3 scheduled events in October, citing personal reasons. For a royal known for consistency, the sudden retreat was striking. His mourning did not fit the palace script of dignified silence. It was deeper, more human. Friends later remarked that Edward never truly spoke of Diana's death. Unlike his siblings, who gave interviews or speeches, he carried his grief quietly into the 2000s. At family gatherings, if her name arose, he would bow his head slightly but rarely contribute. Yet behind that silence was a man who had cared deeply and lost profoundly. His reaction, hidden from public eyes, only deepened the mystery of how much Diana truly meant to him. Nearly 8 years later, as the monarchy attempted to heal and Charles prepared to remarry, Edward's quiet grief resurfaced in a shocking way. At the wedding of Charles and Camilla in April 2005, Edward made a small but unforgettable gesture. It was not loud, not public, but those who witnessed it understood instantly. He had not forgotten Diana. His words, written in ink, still echo inside palace corridors. The wedding guestbook message that shocked the family. On April 9, 2005, St. George's Chapel in Windsor was filled with history. Charles, at 56 years old, finally married Camilla Parker Bowles after decades of scandal and controversy. Royals, dignitaries, and close friends attended the civil ceremony, followed by a blessing. Amid the pomp, a simple guest book awaited signatures in the reception hall. One by one, family members signed their names, offering polite phrases of congratulations. Edward, however, signed last, and chose words that shook the family. In neat handwriting, he wrote, "May your happiness not come at the cost of others." The line was brief, but it carried heavy weight. Staff who saw it said the room went silent for several moments afterward. It was a statement, thinly veiled yet sharp, hinting at Diana's memory and the pain many still associated with the couple's union. For those who understood the reference, it was as though Diana's ghost lingered over the page. The message was never made public, but whispers spread quickly among insiders. Some described it as Edward's quiet protest against a marriage that had, in his view, begun in betrayal. Others saw it as his final act of loyalty to Diana, a reminder that even in celebration, the wounds of the 1990s had not healed. Regardless, it marked Edward as a man unwilling to erase history, even when palace etiquette demanded silence. In the years that followed, the message took on new significance. As Camilla's role expanded after Elizabeth II's passing in 2022, Edward's words resurfaced in private conversations among courtiers. Now, in the wake of his 2025 confession, the guestbook entry is being re-examined. What once seemed like a subtle protest now reads like prophecy, a warning that the happiness of some within the monarchy had indeed come at the cost of others, most notably Diana herself. With his confession in 2025, Edward's past gestures suddenly gained new meaning. From the note in 1992, to his quiet presence in 1997, to the guestbook line in 2005, a pattern emerges. Edward had always resisted forgetting Diana. As the story unfolded, the question grew louder. What else had he quietly held back? And when his private words finally surfaced, the monarchy itself felt the tremors of truth. Diana changed the royal rules forever. By the early 1990s, the monarchy was facing a reckoning unlike anything in its modern history. Diana had begun breaking every unspoken code. At age 30 in 1991, she openly wept in public, spoke candidly about her depression, and directly challenged the old Windsor mantra, "Never explain, never complain." The public adored it. During visits in 1992 and 1993, crowds surged to touch her hand, their cheers drowning out speeches from other royals. Diana's vulnerability had transformed her into the people's princess. The palace, however, felt threatened. Senior courtiers viewed Diana's openness as reckless, undermining an image carefully preserved since Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953. Charles, consumed by his crumbling marriage, described her behavior as dangerous in conversations later leaked in 1994. But Edward saw something else. He interpreted Diana's candor not as rebellion, but as humanity. He reportedly told a close aide in 1995 that if the crown cannot bend, it will break. His warning would prove hauntingly accurate. The Panorama interview in November 1995, watched by over 23 million viewers in the UK, crystallized Diana's war with tradition. While Charles fumed and the Queen was horrified, Edward quietly withdrew to his Bagshot Park residence. Friends recall he spent hours rewatching the broadcast, reflecting on how Diana's raw honesty had exposed cracks in the monarchy's walls. To Edward, the program did not feel like betrayal. It felt like truth finally being spoken aloud. By 1996, as Charles and Diana formally divorced, Edward stood at a crossroads. He remained loyal to his family, but increasingly questioned whether the emotional coldness at its core could survive the new century. Diana had shown him and the world that monarchy could not thrive on duty alone. Her emotional courage had changed the royal rules forever. Edward carried that lesson with him into the decades that followed, quietly resisting where others conformed. When Diana died in 1997, her legacy did not die with her. Instead, it lived on through those who dared to question the old codes. Edward became one of them. Though never as loud or visible as William or Harry, his resistance was steady. It emerged in choices, in silences, and in subtle acts that defied palace expectations. And each quiet act added to a portrait of a prince torn between duty and truth. Edward's quiet resistance over the years. In the aftermath of Diana's death in August 1997, Edward changed. While his siblings leaned closer to Camilla as Charles rebuilt his public image, Edward kept his distance. Between 1998 and 2005, he skipped at least 9 family events where Camilla's presence was central. Officially, scheduling conflicts were cited, but insiders whispered that Edward's absences were deliberate, a silent protest against a woman he believed had caused Diana's deepest pain. When Charles and Camilla finally wed on April 9, 2005, Edward attended the ceremony but remained cool. His guestbook message, "May your happiness not come at the cost of others," was his boldest written protest. But even afterward, his resistance endured. In 2007, at an anniversary event for Diana's charities, Edward reportedly bristled when courtiers suggested minimizing references to her. "She cannot be erased," he snapped, walking out of a planning meeting after just 15 minutes. Through the 2000s, Edward's resistance shifted into subtler acts. He refused to join palace efforts to modernize Diana's legacy by softening her most controversial moments. At receptions in 2012 and 2017, he pointedly praised her work with AIDS patients and landmine victims, topics the Crown often glossed over. For Edward, defending Diana's raw truth was more important than presenting a sanitized history. His loyalty to her legacy was unwavering, even decades after her passing. By the time Elizabeth II died in September 2022, Edward had carried nearly 25 years of silent protest. He walked beside Charles and Camilla during the funeral processions but avoided warm exchanges with the Queen consort. His silence was a message. Courtiers later admitted that his restrained hostility remained one of the few unresolved wounds within the family. His quiet resistance was not defiance for its own sake. It was his way of keeping Diana's memory alive. That resistance reached its peak in 2025, when Edward's private words finally escaped into public view. What he had guarded for decades spilled into the open, a single, devastating sentence that reignited the Diana debate. For Edward, it was truth long overdue. For Charles, it was a dagger to the heart. And for the monarchy, it was a reminder that buried memories always find their way back to light. The sentence that changed everything. In early March 2025, Edward's private conversation with confidants leaked. The words were simple, yet explosive. She didn't deserve any of it. For the first time in nearly 28 years, a senior Windsor had acknowledged Diana as the victim, not the problem. He went further, saying Diana embodied the crown's true values more than the royals themselves. His confession was reported by The Times on March 14, 2025, and within hours, headlines swept across Britain. The impact was immediate. Polls conducted by YouGov on March 16, 2025, revealed that 68% of respondents agreed with Edward's statement. Many said they had felt the same for decades. Palace aides were split. Some privately praised Edward's courage. Others feared his words would destabilize Charles's reign. The silence from Buckingham Palace only added to the intrigue. The king, sources claimed, was heartbroken, his grief compounded by his brother's break in silence. For William and Harry, Edward's sentence resonated powerfully. William, now 42, has often walked the line between protecting the crown and honoring Diana's memory. Harry, estranged in California at age 40, reportedly told friends that Edward's words finally spoke the truth he had long carried. For the first time in decades, the brothers felt their uncle had given voice to what they could not. Inside the palace, the fallout was intense. Meetings stretched for 5 hours as advisors debated responses. But Charles chose silence. An acknowledgement would only fan flames. Yet that very silence spoke louder than words. Edward's sentence had altered the narrative permanently. Diana was no longer just the people's princess. She was, through Edward's confession, the crown's truest royal. The storm Edward unleashed is not fading, it is reshaping the monarchy. His words now hang in the air as both judgment and prophecy. For some, it is reckoning long overdue. For others, it is betrayal. But for the monarchy's future, it may prove to be the beginning of something deeper, a confrontation with truth that can no longer be delayed. What this means for the future of the monarchy. Edward's confession has forced the royal family into new territory. For decades, the Windsors avoided reckoning with Diana's treatment, but in 2025, Edward cracked the wall of silence. Younger royals, including William's children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, are being raised in a world where Diana's openness, not cold reserve, is admired. Courtiers now admit privately that Edward's words echo the feelings of a new generation inside palace walls. Charles, now 76, is said to be devastated. His reign was meant to solidify stability after Elizabeth II's death in 2022. Yet Edward's comments reawakened ghosts of the 1990s. Insiders reveal the king spent nearly 3 hours in his study after hearing the leak, emerging red-eyed. For him, the tragedy of Diana was personal, but Edward's framing made it political, an indictment of the monarchy's very soul. For the public, Edward has been recast. Once seen as the quiet, dutiful sibling, he is now viewed as a reluctant truth-teller. His approval ratings surged in March 2025, with polls showing 54% of Britons felt he represented the moral voice of the monarchy. The transformation is extraordinary. Edward, who spent decades in the shadows, has emerged as a figure of conscience. The monarchy remains intact, but the scar is undeniable. Edward's confession has cemented Diana's place not only in history, but in the ongoing story of the crown. She is no longer just the princess lost in 1997. She is the standard by which royals are now judged. And as Britain looks toward the future, the question looms: will the Windsors embrace the truth Edward spoke? Or will they crumble beneath the weight of what they tried so long to forget? Edward's words hit harder than scandal. They reignited Diana's memory in the very heart of the monarchy. Staff whispered that Charles felt betrayed, yet the public hailed Edward as a truth-teller. For the first time, the quiet Windsor was cast as Diana's fiercest defender, his loyalty stretching nearly 28 years beyond her passing in 1997. The monarchy remains silent, but the people now ask, if even Edward admits Diana's mistreatment, how long can the crown ignore her story?